Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Welcome, audience, to the Talking Deen podcast. I'm your host, Majid, and today I have with me, as usual, Brother Rash.
Assalamu
and
alaikum.
Also, special guest today, Brother Aftab.
Assalamu alaikum.
How's it going, brothers?
Alhamdulillah, really good. Really
Alhamdulillah.
Good.
You guys been
colder days, but nice weather today. Alhamdulillah.
MashaAllah. Well, we've got the Costa courtesy of the brothers, inshallah ta'ala, to keep us warm.
I thought we'd got sponsored by them, but we're not there yet.
No, we're not there yet, man. We're not there yet. So yeah, inshallah, the discussion we want to have today is linked to the issues of Brexit. Certainly, with it happening, I think when we're going to release this podcast, it should be on the October 31st, inshallah. That's a signal for your brother Cam there to get it out on time. But yeah, so what's your thoughts on what's happening in Brexit?
I thought I was going to escape the subject of Brexit, but you can't seem to get away from it. I've got two opinions on it. First of all, I hope it is delayed for as long as possible, because it's actually quite amusing watching the politicians argue over this issue.
You might get your wish. I think it's already probably going to get delayed till the end of January by the sounds of it.
I saw a little meme someone sent the other day that the year is 2133, and the British Prime Minister has gone to Brussels to
negotiate another deal.
to negotiate a delay, but no one knows where this tradition has started from.
Yeah.
So there's a humorous aspect to it. But I think the other thing for me is, and this is what the topic of my discussions, especially with Muslims, is that Brexit highlights everything that is actually wrong with democracy to the average person that they can understand, such as that actually the people don't have a say, which is one of the key principles of democracy. B, it doesn't matter what the people think. It's the influences of society who are going to get their way regardless. And if the people are against that influence, then it's only a matter of time before they're going to change what the people think and impose their view anyway. Okay. I think that's what's just a continuation.
Well, even if we look at what's happening at the moment, it looks like there might be another election. So that's like the latest, isn't it, really, that there's a potential for like Brussels to come back and say, it might be, we'll give you a short extension, which won't allow them to have a full election again. But it doesn't look like that's going to happen. I reckon they'll get an extension till end of January, and they'll have a general election again, just to for the Tories or for people to solidify their positions. Because the problem is, it's like what you just said. In a way, it is amusing to see the constant bickering that is happening and there's no agreement. But actually, that personifies the divisions that are out on the ground as well. So, okay. But in my point of view, in terms of if someone was to ask me, what is your opinion on it? What would you like to happen? To be fair, it's a difficult one to answer. And if you give me a minute, what I would say is at a personal level, I reckon what will happen is that, if it happens and when it happens, and I personally think it will, is that a lot of the fear-mongering that happened was Islamophobic. A lot of the fear-mongering that happened before the Brexit vote was very much anti-immigration. So I think there will be this continued increase of like far-right and kind of these populist type movements. I think that will continue, and the common person, Muslim, will have issues because of it. We can already see hate crime and stuff going up.
Yeah.
But then the other side of me is like, actually, if it happens and Britain leaves the EU and the EU weakens because of it, and therefore the EU breaks up, actually, that is actually advantageous for Islam in its entirety at an ummah level. Because a lot of these establishments that have been very anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim world, as the stronger they are, the more difficult it is for Muslims. And the weaker they become, that will be kind of the pathway for Muslims to realize that we need something of our own, and it will be strengthening for the Muslim situation. So that's why I think there's a few different views potentially you can take.
Yeah, subhanAllah. So, to me personally, I've not spoken to many Muslims about the Brexit issue, because normally we speak to Muslims, it's about more international issues that affect the Ummah. But nevertheless, all the issues affect the Ummah, because the Ummah is global, right? But the normal discussion you have with the English or non-Muslims is they're fed up. They're completely fed up. They don't want to hear the word Brexit. And if you bring it up, they'll try to shy away from their original position, which a lot of them said, they wanted to leave, right? But, in regards to Muslims, because like I said, I've not really spoken to many Muslims about this topic, but as Muslims, especially those living in the UK, right? What sort of stance should we have towards the Brexit issue? I mean, should Muslims be in this Remainer leaver camp? You know what I mean? Does this thing should it even exist for the Muslims living in the UK, or is the argument that look, at the end of the day, Muslims are living in the UK, any laws and whatever's going to be passed is going to influence them directly anyway, so Muslims should have some sort of a stance, not so much of what you guys have just said there, because you guys have left out the small talk and gone straight into it, alhamdulillah, which is good. But I'm saying that normally you speak to other people, maybe you've guys spoken to more Muslims than I have about this issue, but should the Muslims have a stance, or are there a lot of Muslims out there who are like saying, yeah, I'm pro-Remain and I'm pro-Leave?
Yeah, I would say personally, I don't think I have not had that many discussions one-to-one with Muslims who kind of have a real good solid kind of opinion on it. Generally speaking, when you speak to Muslims, like the small talk side of things is they're concerned. They have a concern that even if, like the whole Brexit thing kind of came out of divisions in society. So in general terms, like it was more a case of some of the elite side of, like London, for instance, voted Remain predominantly. And it was many of the more poorer places that voted to Leave. So actually what happens is a lot of the Muslims are actually in many of the poorer places as well. They're scattered. So what you end up seeing is that, like, if you speak to the common Muslim, they'll be like, if this is going to cause a problem for my kids at school, or if this is going to cause a problem for me in society, even if they vote kind of Remain, they're thinking that from a personal point of view.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of stance most people have had, and they're worried more so that what if Leave just means that, like the bigots just become, more emboldened.
Yes. So
and that's what I think.
So it's not an ideological sort of viewpoint on that. I mean, to be honest with you, from what I have seen is a lot of people, as long as the conversion rate between the pound and the rupee stays well, they ain't really bothered. But what's your view on that, Aftab?
I think to echo what Brother Rash has just said, I think a lot of us, our parents were first generation immigrants, and they remembered what it was like trying to establish a place within a society which was predominantly white and was very nationalistic, and they were reluctant, and there was resistance to having people come in and have them amongst them. So we saw or we hear at the time that they came in, there was a rise of the right-wing movements. And with the discussion of Brexit, we've seen that come back. And the point that Rash made was spot on, was that what were people referring back to was what was it like before the immigrants came in, and they were referring to the Muslims who came back in, the 70s. And I think the parents remember what this time was like, and they are now reiterating that to their kids, that this is the time that's going to come back. So I think what's happened now is that people have agitated the emotions of the Muslims, especially with regards to their interests, on two key things. A, your safety, because the right wing with the rise is they're going to target you,
of course,
which has happened. And I don't think it's just to do with Brexit. I think it's just the whole general theme that's going on with regard to the war in Islam. But Brexit, I think, is the excuse for it. And the second thing is, what is the future of your children going to be like? And that point is striking home, because apparently EU is the source of our rizq, apparently.
Yeah. So in regards to the whole Brexit thing, if you think about it, what it boils down to, something you mentioned at the beginning, was democracy. Okay. Now, when we think about the democratic system, certainly with Muslims living in the West, I mean, for a very long time now, I think it would amongst Muslims, it might be common knowledge that there are voices out there who say that democracy is something which is un-Islamic. Okay, that there are people out there who say that democracy contradicts Islam, and in fact Muslims shouldn't really have any role to play in a democratic system. Okay, but in regards to democracy itself, then, because if you think about when people are speaking about Brexit, and especially the people, both sides, whether the people who are leavers, they are saying that this was the biggest democratic vote the nation has spoken, and you can't go against it. And on the other side, people say, look, people were lied about. So if they had the right information and they had went through the democratic vote, then the result would have been different. Okay, but from an Islamic point of view, to do with the issue to do with democracy itself, I mean, is this something which is problematic in general for Muslims, Brexit or no Brexit?
No, it is, and this is the thing. And I've had this conversation actually very recently with the three brothers. And before, I was more of the impression that majority of Muslims understood this already, but actually there was some of the angles not everybody is aware of until they've sat down with someone and really thrashed it out. They don't realize, because what I mean by that is, for instance, this idea that democracy can exist whilst, from an Islamic point of view. In other words, are the two compatible? I think not many people have really thought through, and from a Muslim Islamic perspective, the fact that what democracy is doing, or what democracy stands for, is rules coming from people. So at the end of the day, so even the terminology, even if we go kind of from a terminology point of view, democracy comes from demos kratis. Yeah, it comes from the fact that people rule. Yeah, and in other words, the sovereignty, another way to look at it is sovereignty comes from people all of a sudden. So the rules are made by people, and the thing that you hear, power for the people, or the rules from the people, by the people, for the people. Yeah. That's another kind of terms that are used. So democracy is understood as that from its very origins.
So when you say it's from the people,
yeah.
Okay, by the people,
yeah.
What's the problem with that?
The problem with that is the sovereignty aspect, and this is the aspect that needs clarifying amongst Muslims, is sovereignty. What does that mean? Sovereignty means even the rule that you come up with comes from here, comes from your mind, from man.
Okay.
Whereas this is where it's problematic with Islam, is rules do not come from man's aql or man's mind. They come from the Sharia. They come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you break this down for people and say, wait there a minute, when you're making man's rules here, and we already know Allah's rules should be here, what are you doing? You're bringing the two to the same level. And as we know, bringing anything to the level of Allah is shirk. And people won't immediately go, well, when I'm voting, I'm not committing shirk. They're not going to think that. If they knew that, would they do it? And this is where I think the clarification needs to be had, that democracy in itself is un-Islamic. And I know we can talk about how it's being pushed into our lands and things like that and the reasons behind it. But the fact that the whole thing that democracy is un-Islamic, I think that's very important for Muslims to be aware of that first and foremost.
Yeah, and also just to add to that as well, Rash, I think there will be, you mentioned some people might not understand it. I think some people might not, but some people do. And sometimes they are given a license purely based on benefit. And what I mean by that, and subhanAllah, it's actually what after I've talked about in respect to safety and in respect to your children. Because when the angle is that, look, if you were not to participate and put your vote in the democratic system, then the people who may come into power are going to be the people who are anti-Islam, anti-immigration, whatever, and this is going to affect your safety and it's going to affect the future of your children. So maybe there's that element as well. So, but in regards to the democracy then itself, what we're saying is the fact that this is something which is a foreign idea to Islam, completely foreign.
Completely, and I think when Russia described or defined what democracy is, and the origins of the word are from the people, and when you give the law to the people to dictate, then that automatically removes the right of the creator or takes religion out of the discussion totally. And that's what you see. You see all the advocates of democracy saying religion doesn't have a place, it's up to the people to decide. And when the people decide, then like say, don't refer back to what the creator says.
So what you're saying is obviously democracy is linked to secularism.
Yes.
And linked to the freedoms that emanate from secularism.
It's linked to secularism, and it's become the governing system that the world or what the advocates of it want the world to live by and govern by, because then this puts them on an equal par. And if you look back, and I think this comes down to the other point, like you mentioned, why should Muslims have a stance on this? Actually, I think Muslims should have a stance because
on Brexit, you mean?
On democracy, and then this is obviously linked to how do we partake in democracy in order to have a stance on Brexit?
Okay.
And after the demise of the Cold War, and actually sometimes I forget how old we are because some of your listeners might not even know what the Cold War was.
Bro, speak for yourself.
I think we're all the same age, right? So the Cold War was a fight for two superpowers on how the world should actually live by. So it's two different ways of life. And after capitalism headed by America won that war, they outlined and they clearly said that actually the threat to capitalism now lies in the Muslim world with Islam. And as a result, the focus has become on Muslims abandoning their way of life and adopting a new way of life led by democracy, which is actually the laws should come from us, the people.
You know, actually, just quickly, I didn't know you were going to mention that point, actually. You know, I wrote down that, you know, the NATO General Secretary, Willie Klass, you know, he said after he mentioned, I think he was a number of foreign secretaries back, what he said, the alliance, and this is talking about NATO.
Okay.
Yeah, he said the alliance has placed Islam as a target for its hostility in place of the Soviet Union.
Subhanallah.
Yeah, so it's quite clear, isn't it, that there was a time when it was set up as a means of kind of ensuring that there's a protection against during the Cold War, especially against the Soviets, against the Russians. Well, now that that threat has somewhat been diminished, now we need to utilize it as a mechanism against the Muslims. And how much more clearer does that need to be? So that I found that interesting.
And to add to that, actually, again, you know, being around at that time and we remember the Gulf War, all the world leaders were coming out with it. You know, President Bush Senior was the first one. Margaret Thatcher at the time categorically said Islam replaces the threat posed by the defunct communism. Berlusconi came out with a statement saying that our way of life is superior to the Muslims and we shouldn't be ashamed to say this.
Okay.
So there's many a statement that we can refer back to where the threat of Islam, not physical war, because you know 9/11 as a strategy came way later. We're talking well before this. The threat of Islam as a way of life, in the way people transact and live their life and govern themselves, opposed to capitalism, was identified well before, and they identified Islam as the threat that they need to eradicate.
And you know what, this is what links it back to Brexit. So some people might go, you're talking about Islam there, you're talking about, you know, battle between kind of the Islamic way of life and kind of Western secular way of life. Why is Islam linked to Brexit? So when I was doing a bit of research here, this is where if you look at the events that were going on around Brexit, and I mentioned it right at the beginning, it's very interesting. They did a YouGov poll to people who voted to leave, and quite a significant, like more than 30% of those people were kind of believed kind of conspiracy theories, like what's happening is Muslims are trying to come into the UK and Islamize Britain. So we need to vote against this. Equally, some of the comments that were on social media, and nowadays, as you know, they use social media as kind of a barometer for public opinion.
Yes.
So some of the comments that all of a sudden spiked, and they did some studies, and we should be aware of this. They're very clever at the way they utilize the data. You know, the metadata that comes from all of these different platforms, they use that data to have a look at what words are used with other words. So they'll do things like, and there was this one study that said, and this was in the Times, it said Brexit, Muslim, and then, you know, they've got a way of measuring negative and positive comments. And as soon as they did that, they realized the spike in negative comments off the back of Brexit towards Muslims and Islam significantly increased.
Okay.
So then all of a sudden you can see there's a link.
Okay, so just take things back a little, okay? Because the thing is that we acknowledge that there are Muslims, and as you said there, Rash, the fact that there are many people who probably don't appreciate the reality of democracy and why it's un-Islamic, right? So from an Islamic point of view, what are the evidences? Because at the end of the day, someone might, you know, just argue that, look, it's just me casting my vote. You know, where does it say in the hadith, where does it say in the Quran that democracy, specifically democracy, is something which is un-Islamic? So I think it's only fair that we make it very clear why democracy is something which is prohibited, something which is not does not conform with Islam from the Islamic sources.
Definitely. First and foremost, I would say you have to reflect initially on Allah's name. He is Al-Hakim. Yeah, He is the legislator.
Subhanallah.
Yeah, so the legislator means He makes the rules. How many places in the Quran does it says Hukmu illa lillah? Hukum belongs to Allah in lots of places. Even if you go into like the middle of Surah Ma'idah, several verses one after the other, Allah is constantly rebuking people. He going the kafirun, the dhalimun, the fasikun, and what is he saying right at the beginning? He say the rule must be, the legislation is for Allah. Legislation is for Allah alone. Okay. So there's abundant evidences just from the Quran itself that hukum belongs to Allah alone. In other words, legislation belongs to Allah alone. In other words, sovereignty belongs to Allah alone. All of a sudden, as soon as you embrace democracy, what are you doing? You are embracing that now legislation belongs to man.
Okay.
That's the fund. That was what I'd base my discussion on.
I think that's key there, because sometimes, I don't know if you guys have come across it, but when speaking to people, they'll say, well, look, even in the Islamic rule, humans are involved in ruling. You see, the issue here isn't enforcing or implementing a rule. The issue here is actually legislating what is good, what is bad, what is khair, what is shar. And that's the problem. So, sometimes people think, well, look, even the Islamic system, it may be divine, but humans are still involved, so somebody has to make a decision. But the issue is what you're saying there. You mentioned the legislation is the problem, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his one of his attributes is that he is the only one that has the right to decide what is right and what is wrong. So this contradicts democracy completely, because in democracy, like you guys have said, it's a man and his aql that decides what is right and what is wrong.
And we can see, with what's happening with Brexit at the moment, right, that there is nothing which is actually absolute. You're never going to get an agreement between everyone, not even in one country or one area, yet alone the world. So man is not capable of legislating. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like Rash mentioned, the ayahs in Surah Ma'idah, Allah is rebuking at the highest level those people who rule by other than what Allah has revealed. So it's not like saying, you shouldn't be doing this. Allah is saying, you are kafirun, you are fasikun, you are dhalimun. Yeah, this is the highest of rebuke. So this clearly shows that this is not from Islam. And Allah's rules, when they're applied, are absolute. You're not going to get disagreement amongst Muslims, i.e., should this rule be applied or should it not be applied? How should it be applied? The rule is clear cut. Whereas actually in democracy, you see that is definitely not the case.
And just to add to that, we can see the fact that when creation tries to prescribe laws for other creation, we see the fact that it's never going to work, because people are influenced by bias, they're influenced by their upbringing, their society, subjective, and hence why you see a lot of people being favourable. You're getting extra favours in this sort of society. Why? Because of their, what do they say? It's not what you know, it's who you know. So the thing is that if I'm going to decide what's right and wrong as a human being using my limited mind, I'm really going to base it on what benefits me and what harms me. In reality, if you were to say, what do you think is good, I'm going to say what favors me, right? And the opposite. So if that's the case, then I can't then decide what's right and wrong for you purely on that basic fundamental level, because it's not going to be possible, right?
Exactly.
I was going to say, sorry.
Sorry, yeah.
I was going to say,
guys, this is a perfect example there.
Yeah.
The fact that you guys were trying to, it didn't work.
No, but I think we probably agree on this issue, though. But I think an example of what you just highlighted there has been shown through colonialism, historic colonialism. Wherever the West has gone and colonized their world, trying to impose their way of life on people, the people have hated them, and historically that hatred has remained. And even when there's a new form of colonialism where they go and impose, they take over the establishments or institutions within a particular country, that hatred for the colonialist is still there. So that goes to show the fact that you can't come and impose your view on people who have got different idea, different values.
SubhanAllah. Yes.
All I was going to say is people do is they give undeserved credit to this concept of democracy. Let me explain what I mean by that. Is we're assuming that democracy, when we're talking about it, and this is important when we speak to Muslims especially, is that when the West comes along to us and packages this thing and says this is democracy, we take that at face value and then we go, okay, let's compare it to Islam. Yeah? But you know what? Sometimes let's look at that democracy that they package. That democracy that they bring, it's not democracy at all in itself.
Okay.
What it is I would say their democracy is more like aristocracy, which is like a few people decide the rules, and they give this false feeling of democracy to the people.
I've heard it saying elected dictatorship.
Exactly, it is elected dictatorship. And you know what's interesting about the Brexit issue is that Brexit is almost an example of a pure form of democracy, where one rule: should we leave, should we remain, take it to the people and let them vote. So you could almost argue that Brexit in itself, there's an element of the pure form of direct democracy, pure being, it shouldn't even be used in the same vocabulary as that. But generally speaking, you take a rule, go to the people, should we establish it? If they vote, then implement the rule, and then take the next rule. But what it is completely impractical to take every single rule to the common person and then ask them. And this is what's interesting, is that, if you start doing that, you get what happened now. You get people who haven't got a clue voting on something yes, no, that they do not know the repercussions of it. They wouldn't have known the problems that would have created for the economy, the health service, and all of the things that have been affected because Brexit. All of their MPs are busy trying to sort out Brexit. The country is going down the gutter, yet what the MPs are busy with is trying to sort out Brexit. And actually, who's suffering? The lower class. The people, on minimum wage. Those people are suffering. Why? Because they feel this false sense of, the MPs are trying to implement what I decided. So actually, democracy in itself is wholly impractical. It's flawed.
So even what you said there, if you think about it, the people that are being asked to vote, they don't have that previous information. But you'd have to say that the politicians, they are in a position to make a sound judgment in regards to the politics side of it, right? So here you see that when they have a referendum, this illusion of democracy, if the result is in favor of what they believe themselves, right, they'll pass it through and they'll say this is the will of the people, right? But when they feel that it isn't, what you'll see is what we're seeing today. But just to go back to the issue of democracy as well, because you've given some idea, you've given examples there of, in its reality where it's false, right? But what about the argument where Muslims say that democracy is okay, is fine, because democracy is the same as the Islamic concept of shura? How would you tackle this angle, this argument?
It's a good one, and I actually encourage everyone to anyone who's unsure on this issue to actually Google shura and Islam, and you will actually find that you get a few places where Muslims are talking about shura, trying to give a context, but most of the places that you're going to go and find information on shura are going to come from American think tanks who are trying to find a way to show the fact that Western way of life, democracy, is compatible with Islam. And the only example that they've got to use is this one of shura. Shura it's consultation, and that's what the word is derived from, is to consult. Consultation is good. We consult with each other, and people take this consultation aspect back to Muhammad sallam and to the Khalifs who came after Muhammad sallam, and they say, see, Muhammad sallam engaged within democracy or shura, and they tried to make the two synonymous. And the two are not synonymous, because one is actually where does the rule come from, and that's saying the rule comes from the people. And the other example of shura is where Muhammad sallam and the Khalifs on some issues discussed with a group of people on the best way to go about something, and it wasn't to do with legislation. Legislation was fixed. It was to do with application
and styles
and styles. Maybe, like you say, and most of the examples you're going to find are going to be where shura took place was to do with war, as in what is the best way to implement strategy of war.
But you do have Majlis Shura, don't you?
You have, and that's where the examples came from. And the other thing about these examples were that none of them were actually binding on Muhammad sallam or the Khalifs. These were just discussion that took place from where you could decide on the best plan of action, but the ultimate responsibility was going to be on the head of state, Muhammad sallam, or the Khalifs afterwards to decide. And you can have many examples where some of them Muhammad sallam may have acted upon it, and there's many examples where he didn't. And that goes to show actually that the fact that this shura example is just there for consultation and not for application.
And even the consultation is going to be within matters which are permitted.
Exactly. Isn't it? Nothing to do with legislation.
Yeah. So in itself, would you not say that the fact that they are trying to, or there are certain people pushing this idea, they understand that a lot of Muslims actually, their awareness on democracy is there, because if you were to say to somebody clearly, who has the right to rule, man or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I think any Muslim around the world is going to, when you say it like that and you explain it in a certain way, they're going to say obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But when you say the shura thing, what that does is it sort of like muddies the water. It's not clear now what is it you're trying to portray. And then what you'll do is, like you said, you may give examples from the shura, from Islamic history, when shura was done itself.
Just to add another point, I think when these discussions come about, a Muslim should actually say, let me understand what it is you're asking first. What is democracy and what is shura? Let's understand what the two are and then see whether they are the same or not. And that's when you will clearly find that actually one emanates from a premise that the creator, religion, whatever you want to say, has nothing to do with legislation, and it's the will of the people. And another is something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed on certain issues. Okay. And that's when you actually find whether they're compatible or not. And when you ask the question like that, the answer starts to become quite clear. The fact that actually the two are from two completely different premises, therefore how can they be the same?
Yeah, I think it should be very clear, even just from what Aftab just said there. People should be able to look at it and go, let's look at the two things, let's compare them. Often what happens is, there's this mentality, isn't there, that if we can get across a certain viewpoint, using scholars, using people of knowledge, using literature, using our media, to the common person, that, oh, what you're engaging in is purely just shura, or it's purely just something that is permissible in Islam, and especially when it happens in Muslim lands. Because we're probably talking from the point of view is that there's been discussions, say even in like the UK, about whether you're allowed to vote, and then that argument has been put forward. And actually, then you can have the discussion and go, actually, look, the legislation here is democratic. Whereas the same conversation in Muslim land sometimes might be, look, we have to do something. There are these parties that are involved, the governments are involved, and if we don't get involved, then all of a sudden that's going to be to our detriment. So actually it's very important to have this discussion, as Aftab's described, with people, so they immediately realise that democracy isn't something we can get involved in, but shura is something under the right framework. And then the common person should naturally say, well, what do you want me to do then? Should I do nothing? And that's when, as soon as they come to that premise, do nothing, that's when the conversation needs to be taken forward.
You know what's good there, what you've done? You know when you said it's worldwide? Because there is a different reality in the Muslim lands and here. Here, maybe when people speak about democracy, Muslims, they are looking at it from a point of view. Some may understand it, but they say, well, you know what? It's the example of the less of the two evils, right? But in the Muslim lands, democracy has been sold in a different way, and the reason why that is because think about it, since the demise of the Uthmani Khilafah, the lands were colonized and they were puppet rulers placed over the Muslims, and what we see is that these were dictators. So now when you had 30, 40, 50 years of dictatorship where you have no will, basically you can't express what you feel because you'll be thrown to a dungeon and etc. Now when someone approaches you and says actually democracy is being able to vote what you want, the issue isn't whether they want to vote for secularism or for Islam. No, the issue is when they just think democracy is able to have what you want, vote for what you want, it sounds appealing. But if you were to explain it in the way you have, even the most even those who are living under the brutal dictatorship, they'll understand that this is something which we cannot accept. And an example of that really is the fact that, when the Arab Springs occurred and they were promoting the issue of civil state, okay? And I was reading this article, and there was some Syrian think tank or activists. And what they were saying is that we use the word civil state deliberately because had we used the word secular state, it would have been rejected. And what they said, the reason why we use civil state, even though what that means really is civilian rule, which is no different to democracy, but what the climate of the Middle East was that you had these militaries and these dictators ruling you, so they were selling it as civil state is opposed to a military state, right? So people were, maybe buying into that. But in the reality, when you break it down in the way you guys have done, every single Muslim, I will be able to see and say this is something which we have to reject.
And it's a very good point. And I think what is clear is you could give people a term and misdefine it, and people might run with it. They'll say, yeah, we want democracy, and their understanding might be different. So there might be advocates of the term democracy, but with the Muslims, when you explain what it is and the implications of it, that's when you'll see the hatred for this and the fact that Muslims will reject it.
So quick on that, should we, okay, what you just said there, fair enough, right? But would you say that, is it okay to use Islamic democracy as a phrase which means shura? Is it okay to say that?
No, it isn't, and I think you can give two examples of why this isn't. The Quran says that we should be really careful. Allah says in the Quran that we should be very careful about the terminology that we use, because we don't want something to use a word which is actually associated with a different meaning. That's the first thing. But secondly, I think what's important for Muslims is you can't have a term and redefine it and have a different definitions from the advocates of it and those who are trying to spread it throughout the world. Because that's when you can't have consistency in what is our discussion going to be. So we have to have a united agreement on this is the terms of reference of this conversation that we're going to have. So with democracy or any other term where there might be a misunderstanding, let's agree on what the definition is first.
Especially when we already have our own way of denoting that's what it means. We don't need to replace it with something else when Islam already gives us the correct terminology and what it means.
Exactly, and when we especially go back that the origins of the word the origins of democracy don't come from Arabic or Islam, they come from the Greeks. So let's go back to those people who originated the term, and let's understand what they mean by it, and let's have a discussion on this.
Just with one quick point, the point you made earlier, I think that's really interesting in that, taking from the point of view, we talk about shura, and then that was the angle they were trying to push, and then you mentioned something was about the lesser of the evils. I look at this as in a positive way. So what was happening is, the lesser of the two evils actually defeats their initial stance. So they try to present shura as being democracy. And actually you can see how that failed, because they had to move towards lesser of the evils, because all of a sudden to move to lesser of the evils must mean that you think shura was an evil in the first place. Do you see how that, do you see what I mean? So you're trying to package democracy as shura first. That didn't work. So now what you're trying to go is, oh no, actually both of the things are bad. In other words, getting involved in democracy, okay, we're saying it's un-Islamic. So now you're agreeing that going into democracy isn't actually shura, because shura is allowed, but it is something un-Islamic. However, you're allowed to do an un-Islamic thing if it's the lesser of the evils. In other words, lesser of the evils concept is very much about, is like, if you refrain, the harm that will happen is worse than if you engage. So this concept, so Muslims, especially in the West, especially in Britain, they were pushed down this avenue of anybody who came forward and said, I'm not going to vote, because voting makes man the legislator, and I'm not going to vote, and because those people who understand that this is a level of shirk outright, that they recognize, actually I'm not going to vote. And then the imam or someone came to them and went, there's this concept called the lesser of the evils, that actually we can apply this now, and therefore you should vote, because if you don't, EDL or like Nigel Farage or someone is going to BNP, they're going to all of a sudden come into power, and that, imagine what's going to happen to you then. So you should vote. And this argument was used, so you can see that actually defeated the shura argument for themselves and then presented this new one. So then we should look at this concept of lesser of the evils and recognize that even applying this you're not allowed to apply this in this format, because the lesser of the two evils can only be applied in those kind of life and death type of situations. You can't apply it purely just because, oh, okay, I've got a comfortable life now. All of a sudden, I'm going to use this concept to make my life even more comfortable. No, it doesn't apply.
The thing is, what you just said there about the lesser of the two evils linked to life and death issues, right? From what I understood, to be honest with you, is that in regards to the lesser of two evils, from what I understand, is there's no such Islamic concept. Now that might be controversial, so people can point that out and guide me in that respect, right? Because the thing is that our reference point is the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the best of mankind, right? And when you're talking about the lesser of two evils, what you're saying there basically is that you have two sins. Okay, you can do the one which is lesser of the sin, right? Now, is there any examples that our Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam he did this, right? There isn't. From what I have heard is that you have this sort of issue. Even the evil is probably the wrong word, but you have like sometimes where you have two permissibles, and you can choose which one is the one which is going to be linked to some harm or so, but it's not something which is shar. It's not something which is evil. So you know what you've said there in regards to life and death situations. Even in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, you know, if you're about to die from starvation, that you can eat something which is haram, but even at that time you're not compromising, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you the ijazah, He's given the permission that at that time you can eat it, but you wouldn't have to feel guilty about it, because that thing at that moment is allowed for you. It's no longer an evil.
It becomes permissible. So to clarify this, I tend to agree with you, because this thing where, so what I wasn't saying is that you can go out and do an evil because the other option is also evil. The where it fits, and this is where maybe need some more information, this concept of the lesser of the evils is more about, like, if you're going to do some actions and you know evil may come from it, then do the action which less evil comes from. However, even then you're talking about, it doesn't apply to the situations where, like you say, the actions are sinful in themselves. And also it applies to if there isn't an alternative. So all of a sudden what you're saying is there's two evils in front of me. Are you forced to make that decision, or can you refrain?
Yeah, I mean,
you see what I mean?
I know what you're saying, but the thing is, if going back to the life of the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we can see that, you know, there were many times that he was put in a position, right, where had he gone down a certain route, that would have minimized any evil. For example, the Quraysh, they said to him, you know, that we will believe in what you have for a year, and you do the same, and we can, you know, there were times when, you know, there were times where, if you think about it, when the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam was approaching the different tribes at that time, when he had lost his protection from his uncle, he had lost, you know, his wife Khadija radiallahu anha, right? At that time, when the situation was dire, you would say that when powerful tribes came and said, you know, we'll accept you except for clause number 99, a small, you know, in the small print, he could have said, well, you know what, let me take the majority of it and then I'll try to undo this. But it never happened. So I would argue the fact that, you know, when it comes down to the life of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what he has shown us is that I can't find any example where he chose the lesser of the evil in any situation.
I think this concept of the lesser of two evils is one that is alien to Islam. This isn't from Islam, and like you said, there's no examples of it because it's not from Islam. It actually originates from Christianity, where they talk about the lesser of two evils because, you know, is there some benefit which is, you know, i.e. the harm isn't as bad as the other. What we were talking about here is actually when you're in a life and death situation, and then what is the law of doing something which may have appeared to be haram before, but in that situation it's not. Like the example of eating pork, for example, when you're suffering from starvation, and then at that point pork is not haram for you because it's allowed.
And even that comes from necessity, isn't it?
That comes from necessity, and that was the point I was going to make. Yeah, going to carry on.
No, it's all right.
And I was going to say, a lot of people are now trying to redefine what is necessity, and necessity is clear cut. It's a life or death issue, and that's the only place where Allah has given you leeway to actually do something which in normal circumstance would be haram.
I'll give you an example. So I was speaking to a brother recently, especially because this is quite next level in that there's, I'm not sure the names, they put together like an app for people who are looking to buy houses. So what they've done is they put an app together. You might know it in your. I think the group that have done it is up in Manchester or near kind of up north, and they've put together this app both in Arabic and in English. So if you download this app, you can go through, and it gives you loads of arguments to do with by having a mortgage, and not just even
Islamic arguments.
Yeah, exactly. Islamic, and not just Islamic. You know, any mortgage, any high street mortgage is allowed. And on that, and the app, someone's gone to a lot of effort of putting all of the arguments in Arabic and in English. So if anybody who's confused, especially for the common person, to pick that app up and go, why is it permissible for me to do this? And the crux of it, and I went through it with a brother. I went through all of the different arguments that it was using, the crux, it all came down to one argument. In terms of Sharia, the only thing that it used, and I spent quite a bit of time with the brother with it, the only thing that it used was necessity. That was the only thing that came all the way down to, in the UK, it's a necessity for you to have a house.
Yeah.
SubhanAllah.
And then how does that apply to life and death situation?
It doesn't, and that's why whenever someone uses this example of like saying a necessity, for example, or democracy and shura, we always have to refer back to actually what has Allah said about necessity. Exactly. What kind of situations does it apply, and not only that, what leeway do I have? What are the specific actions that Allah has allowed me to do in that situation? And the necessity aspect, you're right, I've heard it for interest, especially with regards to buying a house. The other example I've really heard it in is when someone is selling alcohol, for example, to say, oh, there's going to be really difficult for you to transact in a halal way, therefore, it becomes your necessity to sell alcohol.
I've not heard that one.
Yeah. No, what I've heard about that one is where it's not even, to be honest with you, I don't know who you spoke to, bro, but I've never heard anyone try to give a Sharia example or excuse to the alcohol. The mortgages they have, because to be honest with you, there are some imams or whoever they are, scholars, or I'm not sure if they're scholars, I'd question their scholarship if they were scholars, to be honest with you, is the fact that when they say like, the first house is allowed to get a mortgage, but
that's exactly what it was saying.
But nothing more than that. But okay, so let's move on, inshallah ta'ala, from mortgages, because I don't think any one of us at this moment in time looking to buy a house. But to do with rulership, to do with democracy, okay? So what about the fact that people can give examples of messengers and prophets from the past who participated, who had positions in non-Islamic systems? For example, you had Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam. He had a position in Egypt as a treasurer, and I think Dawood alayhi salam had some sort of position. So the fact that there were prophets that worked in non-Islamic society systems, how would you tackle that?
So when I have actually come across that argument a couple of times. So whenever I've spoken to people, I clarify on a few different grounds. I highlight the fact that Islam is a perfect deen. As Allah tells us, He has perfected this deen. It has a rule and guidance for every single situation. Okay. So I'll start with that. I'll say, if Islam has brought everything, why do you need to get any legislation from any of the previous prophets? That's not to say that in the same way that the Quran presents examples of the prophets in terms of lessons, and it gives us lessons because those were the hardships and those were the issues that they went through, and it helped the Prophet ﷺ in his times of difficulty, because that's when quite a few of the verses of the Quran regarding the previous prophets came.
SubhanAllah.
Okay, so first and foremost, we know that Islam is perfect and it has all the rules, so we don't need to go to prior kind of evidences, in terms of, not even evidence is the wrong word to use, a prior kind of legislation from previous prophets.
So sharias
from different prophets. Also in the Quran itself, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, and actually it's near those, this is verse number 48, whereas 45, 46, 47 is the ones that talk about legislation is from Allah. So this is verse number 48, where it says, to each among you we have prescribed a law and a clear way, highlighting that each of the prophets came with their own legislation for their people, and the Prophet ﷺ, when he brought the Quran and his Sunnah, his legislation is the final legislation. And what's the word I'm looking at? Abrogates. That's the word I was looking for. All previous legislation. In the same way as we don't take legislation from the Bible, we don't take legislation from the Torah, we take it from the Quran and the Sunnah, and where the mention of the other prophets is there is purely for lessons. That's the way I would normally.
And just to add to what Rashid said, if you look at all the ayahs of the Quran, Allah says, whatever Allah and His Messenger have given you, accept it, and whatever they have told you to abstain from, stay away from it. And there's other examples where Allah says it's not fitting for a Muslim man or woman to have a say on an issue when Allah and His Messenger have already passed judgment. And the other example I just want to give is there was a time, in the hadith you'll find this, where Umar ibn Khattab was, radiallahu anhu, was reading the Torah, and Muhammad rebuked him, saying that if Musa was here today, he would have no choice but to follow what I have said.
Subhanallah.
So this goes to show exactly what Rash has said, that the previous, whatever the previous prophets have given for us, they are stories that we can learn from, but they are not anything for us to act upon.
Okay, there's another angle as well which some people come out with, and we heard this quite a lot. I mean, it may be a classical angle, or maybe it was totally taken out of context, but certainly when the Arab Springs occurred, or Arab Spring, shall I say, we see that when the people were promoting civil state model in the Muslim lands, what they were promoting was something called the Maqasid al-Sharia, okay, the objectives of the Sharia. And this is something which was discussed by one of the classical scholars, Al-Shatibi, rahimahullah, right? And what they took from Al-Shatibi's opinion was that what he said was that the Sharia has objectives, which the Sharia law has certain objectives which it has to meet. Okay, so for example, what he said is that such as the preservation of life, property, mind, religion, and lineage. Okay, so one of the arguments is that if these objectives if the objective of the Sharia is to meet these, okay, is to preserve these points, so you could have a model of ruling which is different to just say the Khilafah, or from what the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam set in establishing Medina. Because a side argument which you guys might want to touch upon is the fact that some people do argue that there's no prescribed system of ruling in the Islam. The way the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam set it up in Medina was just how it was done then. But as long as the maqasid, as long as the objectives of the Sharia are met, this could even be in a democratic system, as long as these are met. And to be honest with you, I even saw a video not long ago where Sheikh Hamza Yusuf was saying something on the lines of that the American Constitution is basically the Sharia, right? So maybe that's coming from the same angle as well. So how do you tackle the issue of the maqasid of the Sharia?
Like this linked back to your last question as well. So if I'll mention that as well, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was offered rulership in Makkah by the Quraysh, what did he do? He rejected, right? So even how it's the reason why I link it to your last question in terms of obviously the different prophets that took part in kind of the establishment or the system, that we can see that the Prophet ﷺ rejected. So when we look at the maqasid, what it's firstly trying to do is when it talks about, and another way of looking at maqasid is like the principles. Yeah. The Sharia outcome is justice. Therefore, any other system that produces justice, that's compatible with Islam. So all of a sudden, that from the point of view of the Prophet ﷺ, if he could get involved in that system and then implement justice, would that have meant automatically that that system was Islamic? The fact that he chose not to get involved, firstly, alleviates, kind of answers the question about, different prophets and whether we can take Sharia from them. But it also highlights to us that being involved in any system that is not Islamic is not allowed. But in terms of specifically what I would say about the maqasid is that, let's take really simple examples. The one that I gave is the justice one, isn't it? So all of a sudden what we're saying is that a good example of this is Egypt used this. Egypt in their constitution. So let's take an example. What it says in their constitution is Islam is the religion of the state. Arabic is the official language. And then it says principles of Islamic Sharia are the principal source of legislation. Yeah. So what it's saying is anything that can achieve things like justice, we can use it as rulership. All of a sudden that means you don't need to use Sharia as the base, as the framework that you take it from. And that's problematic because what you're saying is all of a sudden things that come from the West, what things, what other examples? Freedom of speech, yeah? Freedom of ownership, what other? Freedom of expression. So the argument that is given things like freedom of speech is what protects, allows us to voice our opinion. But actually freedom of speech is also the same freedom that lets people attack the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah. At the same time, it says freedom of belief. They say, that because Islam allows you, if Islam doesn't enforce you to become Muslim, Yeah. So because with Western, secularism and that and democracy allows freedom of belief, that means it's achieving the principle that Islam allows, which is you're allowed to, believe in whatever you believe in. But at the same time, doesn't that also mean that when Islam says you're not allowed to apostate, freedom of belief in the Western framework means you're allowed to apostate? Is that allowed in Islam? It's not. So these principles, and maybe I haven't done it justice in clarifying completely, but these principles are supposed to be used within an Islamic framework, not outside an Islamic framework.
Due to technical issues, the audio may sound distorted from this point onwards. We apologize for this. Please continue to listen on, as some very important points are raised.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would say, because these are objectives of the Sharia. How can you have objectives that are met outside of the Sharia?
Exactly.
Because the thing is that if, for example, one of those things was preservation of religion, as an example, right? So if you had rules in a country which is built on secular Aqidah, where it said that you're allowed to believe what you want. In fact, according to secularism, you're allowed to believe what you want. Okay? So that would mean that we don't need Islam because of this. Or, because to be honest with you, in reality, I'm sure every single country out there has certain objectives, which are preservation of life, property, mind, religion, lineage. To be honest with you, I think every state out there would claim that their objective is also to preserve these things. So hence why what I would say, and add to your point, is that what we're trying to say here is that you can achieve the objectives of Islam, the objectives of Sharia outside of Islam and outside of Sharia, and in that respect, is the argument is just, it's so erroneous. People who promote it, I personally think that they are misinterpreting the scholar Shatibi's sayings, because I'm sure he never said that you could have a democratic, a secular state, as long as these are met. You don't need the hudud, you don't need Allah's laws being implemented. Why would the laws be implemented? Why not just Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just revealed the Quran with just these principles and said, that's it, whoever achieves these, you're sorted.
If you actually read what Al-Shatibi said, he was saying that it is only as a result of the implementation of Sharia that you're going to get these.
Subhanallah.
Right? And I think just to add a couple of more points to what you guys have said, this objectives of Sharia discussion is a new phenomenon. The classical scholars, up until while Islam was ruling the world, this discussion never came up. No one ever questioned the rules of Allah. And I think I'm pretty sure most of the people who are going to be listening are going to think the objectives of Sharia are pretty simple, right? Which is actually we got to implement Allah's rule in all aspects of our life, and it's even within the punishment system. And the other point I just wanted to add is, Allah says in the Quran, and just to give an example from Surah Baqarah, He says, fighting has been prescribed for you, but you don't like it. And it goes on to say that you will like which is bad for you and dislike what is good for you, but you know not, Allah knows best. So I think this verse highlights the fact that what Allah has revealed is what we got to follow. Our mind can't play a part in why has Allah asked us to do this action, because we're never going to know the good or the bad within it. But all we have to do is implement it, and that has been the stance of everyone throughout history up until recently, when actually with the advocacy of democracy and trying to adopt a different way of life and move away from that link between Allah's law and what has man said, that people start to discuss actually these are just objectives of what Allah has intended, and therefore we can follow a different way as long as we achieve that same output.
Okay, subhanAllah.
I just want to clarify something. I don't think you meant this, but I don't think it was a case of any of the scholars needing to reinterpret anything, or that it wasn't clear what Allah's laws was. I think there's a very specific reason why that Al-Shatibi wrote that, was that as new realities came about, the concept of ijtihad, in other words, deriving new rules from a new reality, became more important. You're right, in the earlier generations, that wasn't as important because, okay, the reality was relatively similar, the rules were there, they were implemented, they were governed exactly as they needed to be. Later on, as new realities arose, as we needed to derive new rulings, this framework that was presented was for deriving new rules from Islam. In other words, it wasn't for clear-cut issues like the hudud, like the punishments, like the implementation application of the Sharia, they remain. Even Shatibi himself says that this is not for the clear-cut issues. This is for those issues that we may need to kind of really exert effort to derive new rules from. And when we go to derive a new rule, and this is not for any old person to do, when we go to derive a new rule, when the mujtahid derives a new rule, make sure he thinks about the principles of Sharia. In other words, don't derive a rule from the Quran and Sunnah, then go, okay, this doesn't now give us justice. This doesn't now protect religion. This doesn't now protect. So it was a means to make sure that ijtihad was done correctly.
And I don't see a problem with that. I think it's just the way it's being promoted, and as Afi said as well, the angle of the way it's being promoted now is something which is quite recent. So inshallah, to sort of like bring this thing to a close, one thing I want to speak about briefly, or discuss, shall I say, is the fact that, you know, we can see clearly that democracy is un-Islamic. It's something which has no room in Islam, and even the angles that the people come up with, I think subhanAllah, you guys have done justice in refuting these angles. Why do you think the West has an obsession with spreading democracy within the Muslim lands, within the Muslims? It has an obsession because it just so seems like whenever they talk about the Muslim lands, they will always talk about there's lack of democracy. We want to spread democracy. Yeah, we want to win hearts and minds, i.e. we want people to accept democracy. Why do you think there is this obsession? And I think Afi touched on it a bit more, but it'd be good just to mention it a few times before we bring this to an end.
I think it goes back down to the struggle between Islam and kufr has started from day, has been there from day one. It was evident at the time of Prophet ﷺ, and we've seen it go on throughout history. And today, what we are seeing is, the struggle between Islam and kufr, at a peak, if you like. And I touched on it, as you said, when we were talking about the two ways of life existing in the world. And when you just look at that, it's actually two ways of life where two different sides are saying this is how we need to interact with each other, and this is how the world should operate. And you can't have two opposing views which are going to be able to exist in the world, because by that definition, these ideologies need to spread and accept that the whole world needs to operate on whichever premise we're going to have. And the West have identified capitalism with America as the leader of this and advocate of it, that the whole world needs to operate on their terms. This is why they fought the Cold War, who for their side wanted the whole world to operate on communism. And they identified that the only threat to capitalism now is Islam, because we have our own system and we've got our own way of life. And not only that, we've actually got a successful history to show how this operated throughout the world and how it transformed the lives of people. And they realized that if this is allowed to stem again and spread again, then it's going to overtake their life, their way of life. And for that reason, they made it their mission, the West have made it their mission to make sure that the Muslim world not only abandon Islam in terms of ideas and belief, but they adopt secularism and democracy.
So I think with democracy, I think the key issue is secularism, isn't it? Democracy, like you said, is just like the ruling system in a way, yeah. But the reality is that, what they're not saying is that people have to become atheist, i.e. from a Muslim point of view. But what they're saying is that this world has room for a certain version of Islam which fits in the democratic system, because if Islam is like what they promote as moderate Islam, if your Islam was purely your personal worships, then man has room to make the laws, because what your Islam doesn't cover this area. But if we want to see the Islam which was revealed to the Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which Allah says that He's perfected His deen, it covers all aspects of man's life. This then would not be able to fit in a democratic system, because like you said, there's a clash. One would have to overcome the other. Anything you want to add to that, Rash?
All I would say is it conveniently links back to the whole Brexit issue, is that what we said at the beginning is that there is this clash that is going on in a lot of countries where there's the rise of the right wing. And this rise of the right wing, and even the rise of, even the status quo, people are not happy with, in that the common person under democracy, especially the lower class person, isn't being accommodated for. As we see in a capitalist world, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And this is under democracy. And this is under this framework of capitalism. So the whole Brexit thing came about from that. There was this issue, there's a clash in this society. In this very society, forget the Muslims for a second, there's a clash in this society that is occurring, which is creating this rift. But at the same time, the Western nations, they recognize that if they wanted to, they could try to rectify that clash, but actually they're facilitating it. They're facilitating some of these right-wing movements because they want this clash between disbelief and belief, between haqq and batil. They know that Islam has this power to be able to come against them, and the only way they can fight that is if they completely alienate Islam from the common person. So we're seeing that all around the world, and their way of doing that also in the Muslim lands is to export this version of democracy that they can then control the masses in those Muslim lands even more. So all of this, it kind of comes full circle, because it's very much part of what Aftab's saying is this battle between haqq and batil, and it's important for us to know why that's happening, know that democracy is not from Islam, and then go, actually, all the problems that are created in our lands is because you guys are trying to export foreign ideas that we don't want. We want to live by our ideals, by Islam, but you're trying to export that so you can control us. And it's about time we realize that and we search for the truth in Islam.
Subhanallah. Yeah, I mean, what you've said there sort of like summarizes it perfectly, to be honest with you. But what we can see then is to, sort of like a few points before we finish, is the whole issue of Brexit. I mean, when this is released, maybe England, Britain is still in, or maybe it's out. Obviously, it looks like it's still going to be in, and the facade is going to continue. But
the funny thing is, sorry to interrupt, is that I was thinking we release on that date because something's going to happen. So at least, okay, it sounds like, it's moving. All of a sudden, it looks like nothing's going to happen on the 31st.
I personally think you're very optimistic.
I was very optimistic.
But the thing is what it does show as Muslims, not just in the West, but in the Muslim lands, that in reality is we are one ummah, and the issues, whenever we look at our problems, we should never look at them as individuals. We look at them collectively as the problems of the ummah. And the issue of Brexit, remain, or leave, if people have have an opinion on this, majority of it, and I think you guys have mentioned it, especially people obviously living in the UK, is going to be based on your personal benefits, in all honesty, you understand? But the reality is, for the Muslims, and the bigger picture is that, what we are seeing here is that this is just another flaw in the whole the whole capitalist system. And the way we should see it is that, not just purely from a personal beneficial point of view, the way we should see it is that the whole process is un-Islamic, for a start. And if that's the case, that's good, we should think that, because that will bring about more questions. What are those questions? People think, well, I'm living here, surely I should play a part. But the reality is that maybe this leads to the next question of, is politics something that Muslims stay away from? Or do we have our own version of politics? Should we be living in a society where the politics is not based on democracy or man-made laws, but it's based on the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if we don't live in this society, or if we don't live in this system and it doesn't exist, what are we doing to bring this back? So it actually opens up, more questions for Muslims to be thinking about, but that's only if it's more than just what's going to benefit me, what's going to benefit my children. And I think that's something which is important. So if you guys want to add a few more points, if you think there's anything we haven't covered, and we can bring this to a close.
The only thing I want to add is, I think a lot of the stuff that we talked about today, when you talk with people, on a one-to-one basis, a lot of it isn't new. People will accept this, especially with rizq being from Allah. This is a term that you hear a lot of people say, rizq being from Allah, and also life being from Allah as well. And I think, but when things like Brexit happen, it really challenges people whether they truly believe this, because then they say, just talk about, Brexit is going to impact on my rizq. I think we as Muslims need to go back to understand Islam, but also believe in it and implement it, because I think it's that intellectual aspect of it where we truly believe in it and this governs our life, which is what's holding us back as an ummah. And I think emotionally that attachment is there, clear cut. But until we believe in it and start implementing it and letting this shape our lives, our situation is not going to change. And this is what the West is trying, and not only the West, and I think some Muslims are aiding this by suppressing people's thinking, by keeping them weak, by thinking, no, this is going to impact you in a negative way. Whereas actually we should give Muslims the confidence in Islam. This transformed lives. We've seen it throughout history, from the time of Muhammad ﷺ up until recent times. It transformed the world, and it's been the envy of the world ever since. And that should give us confidence that this is how we want to live our life, not be fearful of it.
Subhanallah, subhanallah. If there's, I mean, the thing is, to be honest with you, we only have a certain amount of time in this podcast, but this has set things nicely up for many other topics. One is, for example, politics in Islam. Is politics, is it a dirty thing? Can we even use the word politics and Islam in the same sentence? Or even the issues to do with whether we are British or French. Before Muslim, or the whole concept of are you British or are you Muslim? Because a lot of people, I don't want to go into it, but a lot of people you speak about, my personal opinion is, a lot of people think, Muslims think that they're going to be here in the West forever and ever and ever, and sometimes you hear them refer to our armed forces when they refer to British forces, our Prime Minister, and really that's something which really angers me actually. But this is not for this podcast. Maybe some good ideas for moving forward, inshallah ta'ala. So if there's nothing else to add, I think Rashid's point is
just advice more than, and I think any advice from us directly, we can't do this type of advice justice in that what Umar radiallahu anhu said. So let's use him as an example, because what he said is we got honor through Islam. So he's describing those people, those Bedouins, those desert dwelling people, and they were fighting each other, the tribes were fighting, and they were a declined people, and they got honor through Islam. And when he tells us that, he says they got honor then through Islam, and we can only get honor through Islam. If we seek honor through anything else, and it applies to democracy, completely applies to democracy. If we seek honor through anything else, then we'll be humiliated. He told us this, he advised us of this, and we should take heed of that. If we seek our honor through Islam again, then our rank will increase. Whereas if we continue to seek honor through these other means, whether it's because we've been duped, whether it's because we're being pragmatic, whatever it is, we need to start seeking honor from Islam again.
Subhanallah, and ending the podcast on a brilliant example there, a piece of advice for ourselves first and foremost, and for all the listeners and the people watching this podcast. So you have to all the audience, whether you're listening or watching, I hope you benefited from this podcast. And inshallah ta'ala, please follow us on all our platforms. There's so many to mention. We have Twitter, we have Instagram, we have YouTube, Telegram, and obviously all popular podcast platforms. And support us, inshallah ta'ala. We can't do this without the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and without your support. So if there's any topics that you think we should cover, let us know, get in contact, get in touch. This is your podcast, and we're doing it for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also to get awareness, to generate awareness in the ummah as well. So inshallah ta'ala, on that note, jazakallah khair for watching or listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Thanks for watching that video. For more exclusive videos, please like, share and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget, you can listen to some of our shows wherever you are, because we're also available on all popular podcast platforms. And for more Voice of the Ummah content, make sure you check out the links to all of our social media platforms in the description below.